Well, good evening. I'm Tim Reeves. I'm the Deputy Director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library Museum. So welcome and thank you for coming out tonight. Tonight's part of our week-long commemoration of the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And this special week is the result of the generosity on the part of a lot of folks. And all the programs and exhibits that we enjoy here at the library are possible through our partnership with the Eisenhower Foundation. In fact, these things would not happen without the Eisenhower Foundation, so we are extremely grateful for your support. And also a number of other sponsors who have helped this important week in commemoration. Well, our special guest tonight is Dr. Nigel Hamilton. Nigel is the best-selling and award-winning author of multiple and multi-volume biographies, such as General Bernard Law Montgomery, Eisenhower's best friend, President John F. Kennedy, President Bill Clinton, and now President Franklin Roosevelt, among many other subjects. He's a senior fellow at the McCormick Graduate School at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and now splits his time between Boston and New Orleans. And Nigel joins us today again as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of D-Day to discuss his trilogy, FDR at War, which coincidentally and conveniently is for sale in our gift shop, and I know Nigel will be happy to make a personal inscription in your book. Silence cell phones, that's the one thing I forgot, so please do silence your cell phones. And then please help me welcome Nigel Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you very much for coming here this evening. This is, as you know, a very special week, the 75th anniversary of D-Day, the great landings in Normandy. And I'm honored to be able to talk for a little while this evening with you about not only about D-Day, but about the man, the president, who made D-Day possible. And so that's why I've called my talk FDR, the man who saved D-Day. This is the central focus of the final volume of my trilogy about FDR as Commander-in-Chief of World War II, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States in World War II. I began, incredibly, 10 years ago, intending to write a small book about FDR as Commander-in-Chief, because I was surprised when I was writing a book called American Caesars, based on a famous Roman text, The 12 Caesars by Suetonius. And I was writing a book about the 12 presidents from FDR through to George W. Bush in their role as commanders-in-chief and basically leaders of the Western world. And in doing that, writing that book, American Caesars, I was amazed that nobody, no American historian, had seen fit to write a full study of FDR as Commander-in-Chief in the most violent war in human history. And of course, one of the reasons, well, there were two reasons. One was that FDR died in April of 1945, shortly before Hitler committed suicide, and so wasn't able to write the story of the war himself. And the other reason was that Winston Churchill, who was almost 10 years older than the president, survived the war and did write about it. In fact, not only wrote about it, wrote 6 volumes about it, and called it not my memoirs, but the Second World War. The the unwritten subtitle was How I Won the Second World War. And being a brilliant, magisterial writer, in fact, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, largely because of this 6-volume work. Winston Churchill was able, in the early 1950s, to present the story of the war as a vast conflict which he had been able to triumph in as the mastermind, the Allied mastermind, with President Franklin Roosevelt as a sort of benign cousin who'd loaned him some troops. Obviously, I'm exaggerating somewhat, but that is the fundamental thrust of the Second World War, brilliantly told, with a massive amount of documentation, which the Prime Minister stole from 10 Downing Street when he was diselected in 1945, and set about writing this 6-volume series. I mean, partly the series was to tell his story. He'd always said in the war that history would be kind to him because he would write it. But it was partly because he'd lost his political position as Prime Minister in 1945, and he thought that writing about how he had won World War II would enable him to recover the Prime Ministership, which in fact happened. So any poor historian, British or American, and I'm binational now, has a tough task in trying to rectify our understanding of the strategy and basically the running of World War II at its very highest level. I mean, we're talking about the President of the United States in his role as Commander-in-Chief. We're talking about the British Prime Minister in his role as quasi-Commander-in-Chief of British Empire forces. Churchill was only Prime Minister of Great Britain, but he made himself Minister of Defense, and the various British colonies and dominions deferred to him as quasi-Commander-in-Chief. So there were the two main leader figures of the Western world acting in an alliance from the time of Pearl Harbor. And obviously, the other main figure was Marshal Stalin. So my challenge, if you like, was how to tell this story of how FDR directed World War II as Commander-in-Chief, really for the first time. And the little book that I intended to write inevitably became a 10-year project. And so, I've just put in a little amuse-bouche, as the French call it. I confess to a very personal connection with D-Day. My father was evacuated at age 21 from Dunkirk, and he landed once again in France in 1944 in the D-Day invasion as a 25-year-old infantry battalion commander on Juno Beach. And after the war, he took my brothers and me to camp in the fields of Normandy. And I could never quite understand, I think, is this a, here we are, that's me. I could never understand retrospectively, later on, why, if you were a veteran of Normandy, why would you take your kids to camp in, what was hardly a playground. I mean, here were these German blockhouses, and when we pulled up our tent pegs at the end of the summer, I mean, they would be impaled on spent cartridges. These were the battlefields that he'd fought in June, July, and August of 1944. And though I did write a book with him at the end of his life, he was became a very distinguished journalist, I never asked him that question. Dad, I didn't object. I loved those summers and French food. But I often think now, looking back, he did tell me while I was helping him with this late autobiography, he did say that a battalion has roughly 1,000 men. 600 men became casualties in the Normandy battle. And I think in some way he was taking us back there with our mother to sort of honor the men who'd fallen and who didn't make it. Anyway, this week I certainly remember him and all the other troops who risked and gave their lives for that invasion to succeed. Here he is, Lieutenant Colonel in Holland. He defended the Nijmegen Bridge, which American troops had captured in December of 1944, and won the DSO in the field. And through him, he was decorated with this Distinguished Service Order by the Commander-in-Chief of the British armies, Field Marshal Montgomery, who encouraged him to stay in the army after the war, but he was finished, exhausted by it, and returned to journalism. He'd been a junior reporter on a local newspaper, never went to college. But he did become ultimately editor-in-chief of the London Times and Sunday Times, and he maintained a good relationship with Field Marshal Montgomery after the war, and through that relationship I came to know Field Marshal Montgomery very, very well. Stayed with the Field Marshal on many occasions at his home in Hampshire, in southern England. And I may say it was Field Marshal Montgomery who took me, I am so ancient, took me as a 19-year-old student to stay with Winston Churchill himself at Chartwell in Kent. And we spent a weekend there with Churchill and Lady Churchill and their two daughters. So for me, writing a book that culminates, a trilogy, let's say, that culminates with D-Day, the crucial battle of World War II, has been not only a huge challenge as a historian, but also a very personal challenge. To think that I actually knew the commander-in-chief of the Allied armies at D-Day, the American, British, and Canadian armies, under General Eisenhower, Field Marshal Montgomery, and that I actually stayed with Winston Churchill, is something that sometimes I scratch my head and think, am I dreaming? Is that possible? But it certainly gives me, sometimes historians lie awake at night and wonder whether they're inventing history, whether they really, in terms of the paperwork, the documents, whether they really understand the true story of what they're telling. After all, they weren't usually there themselves, and I certainly wasn't. I draw a certain consolation thinking that the story that I have told, as Tim said, I wrote a biography also in 3 volumes of Field Marshal Montgomery, although obviously I was only born in 1944. I have known some of these figures. I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of veterans who served in World War II at very senior levels under General Eisenhower and Field Marshal Montgomery, and alongside Winston Churchill. And so I have a certain feeling that a feeling of not exactly entitlement, but at least an entitlement to tell the story again as I see it. And to me, one of the most remarkable untold stories of World War II is just how Franklin Roosevelt, who had, after all, never been to military college, he had, yes, been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, but who'd never actually been to college, how it was that he came to direct the forces of the United States and pretty much the forces of the democracies in World War II so amazingly successfully after defeat at Pearl Harbor. How was it that he, after that tremendous debacle in Hawaii, how is it that he put together the command structure, the political structure, but also the actual means, the logistical means for the United States, not only to defeat the Japanese and the Germans, but to prepare the world for a post-war order in which a Third World War or a war like World War II would be not unthinkable, but would be difficult for any nation to pursue. And so I called the final volume of my trilogy War and Peace. And I'll just run through the first 2 volumes, The Mantle of Command, which goes from Pearl Harbor through to, in fact, it starts with FDR's meeting with Winston Churchill aboard their respective battleships just off the coast of Newfoundland in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, where FDR forces Winston Churchill to sign the Atlantic Charter, much to Churchill's reluctance as an imperialist. And it ends with FDR overruling his military advisors and chiefs of staff and saying, no, we will not land in France. There will be no cross-channel invasion this year in 1942. We will land where the Germans are weakest. We will learn how to defeat German forces, the Wehrmacht, in battle. And so here are American forces landing in Northwest Africa, the alternative to 1942 cross-channel landing in North Africa, in Morocco and Algeria, and triumphant landing, which in the second volume begins with FDR taking his first president to fly in office, and certainly in combat to a foreign country, takes his flying boat to Casablanca, not only to meet his commanders in the field, General Eisenhower, General Mark Clark, General George Patton, but to, once again, as with the Atlantic Charter, to set out a moral basis for the American project in World War II. And in Casablanca, somewhat again to Churchill's surprise, the president announces to the world's press a policy of unconditional surrender. This time, there will be no armistice. There will be no negotiation with Nazis. There is only one ending to World War II, and that will be the defeat and surrender, unconditional surrender of the Nazis and the Japanese. And the president's strategy of American forces fighting in the Mediterranean and learning how to defeat the Wehrmacht in battle is hugely successful. I mean, we're talking about barely a year after Pearl Harbor, an Axis army, German army in North Africa of 250,000 men surrendered to General Eisenhower, his commander in the field, his Allied commander in the field. And that's in May of 1943, by the summer of 1943, in July and August, the Allies land in Sicily, conquer the island of Sicily, and establish themselves in southern Italy. All in less than a year and a half, really. So that is a tremendous achievement in terms of strategy and realistic direction of American forces in the West. And so when the Nigel's third and final volume starts, the president is relatively pleased with himself because he has gotten the British, under their Prime Minister, to agree at Quebec to finally launch the D-Day invasion, it's called Overlord, on the 1st of May 1944. As soon as the winter's over and the English Channel is more or less passable, the Allies will land somewhere in northern France, probably in Normandy. And the president feels that it is time, this is in November of 1943, it is time to meet with the third piece in the equation, Marshal Stalin. Because he hopes that as the Allies land in Normandy, he can persuade the Russians to mount a similar offensive on the Eastern Front. And that will stop the Germans being able to move forces from the Eastern Front to meet the Allied invasion. So the beginning of War and Peace it begins with the president going on a voyage once again, this time back in a battleship, the USS Iowa, the latest American battleship at the time, with his chiefs of staff, General Marshall and Admirals King and Leahy. And they are looking forward to meeting with Marshal Stalin, but they are worried about something because they have heard that the British Prime Minister, who has signed up to D-Day at Quebec, is going back on his word. He has returned to London after Quebec, and he is telling everybody in London that he ain't going to do it. He doesn't think it will work. He thinks the English Channel will be running with blood, red with blood. And he has a much better British idea. Don't do D-Day. Stay in the Mediterranean. Make sure that the sea lanes to the British Empire, to India, to Hong Kong when it's recaptured, to the Far East, are preserved. And just use air power against the Germans, or fight in Italy. Perhaps take Rome, invade the Dardanelles, as he tried to do in World War I, possibly the Balkans. If the Germans start running away, perhaps go to Vienna. But don't cross the English Channel. Nobody's done it for 1,000 years since William the Conqueror. Don't do it. He had tried, in fact, a little mini invasion in the summer of 1942 at Dieppe, and it was a disaster using Canadian troops. Almost 1,000 Canadians killed within 3 hours on the beaches, never got off the beaches. So Churchill is adamantly opposed, even though he's signed up to do it. And logistically, preparations are being made all across the United States for this invasion, making tanks and planes and support weapons. But the United States cannot conduct this amphibious landing across the English Channel unless at least half the troops are British. By British, I mean Canadian and other forces. So the president, sitting on the USS Iowa, faces probably I think, as a historian, it's probably the greatest crisis of World War II, at least in terms of the West rather than the Pacific. And astonishingly, this is very little covered by historians since World War II, partly because Winston Churchill told the story in a different way. He said, well, I wasn't against Overlord, I just felt there were other things we could do and then do Overlord and so forth. But in fact, the truth was, he, as we now know from the documents, he threatened the British War Cabinet that he would resign if President Roosevelt insisted on D-Day in May of 1944. And the date is terribly important because the president wanted D-Day to take place in the spring to allow for a summer campaign using American armor, tanks. And over 1 million Germans were in France and along the Atlantic coast. It would obviously be a real ding-dong battle, and that you would need enough time, summertime, to defeat the Wehrmacht, just as it had taken months in North Africa. Therefore, time was of the essence. It couldn't be simply delayed or put off. It had to be in the spring of 1944. And the Americans were ready. Why not do it? Well, that was the situation facing the president, and which is the sort of crisis at the beginning of the final volume. So here is this president who is patiently but methodically prepared the United States for this great moment. And coincidentally, Hitler is meeting with his generals and saying he's quite sure that the Allies will land in the spring of 1944, and that the Wehrmacht will rub them out because, as he says, I do not think, this is an actual quote, I do not think the British have their, shall we say, heart in the project. And how right he was. So that's the crisis facing the president and commander-in-chief of the United States forces in World War II in November of 1942. A crisis you very rarely hear about, especially in terms of talking about World War II. And to my mind, as a biographer and historian, the story of how FDR faced this British, whatever you want to call it, insurrection, rebellion, refusal, denial, is a rather wonderful story which demanded all FDR's charm, intelligence, realism, and steeliness. We probably don't have time to go into it in great detail, but it is the core of the final volume. And it's a pretty extraordinary story. The first thing the president does when the USS Iowa comes into harbor at Oran is to meet with General Eisenhower, the Allied commander-in-chief in the Mediterranean. Because Eisenhower has just spent a day with Winston Churchill. And the president wants to know, through Eisenhower, just what he's up against. I mean, let's face it, Winston Churchill was one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. I mean, an extraordinary, not just an extraordinary orator, and not just an extraordinary writer, but an extraordinary debater. And there were very few people in this country or in Britain who felt able to meet Winston Churchill on level ground in terms of argument. So Eisenhower explains to the president, there's the president's plane, probably in its post-war colors, but that is the president's plane, which was going to take him from Oran to Cairo to meet with Churchill on their way to see Stalin. The president's plane, I'm sure you know, was nicknamed the Sacred Cow. So they traveled together on the Sacred Cow to Tunis, to Eisenhower's headquarters. And there the president sits down with Eisenhower and his senior staff officers, and also some younger officers, because he wants to hear not just the sort of official view, but the sort of view of ordinary combatants. He wants to know the truth. Are we up to it? Can we land on D-Day? Will it be a success? And he doesn't tell Eisenhower he's going to appoint him because he's promised the supreme command of D-Day for several months to General Marshall. But he's really sounding out whether Eisenhower is the right guy to command D-Day. Again, you very rarely read about this in histories of World War II, but it is a remarkable story. There's General Bedell Smith there. And the amazing thing is, historically, that at the very moment the president is setting forth to meet with Winston Churchill in Cairo and then flying on to Tehran to meet Stalin, Winston Churchill is on his battleship, HMS Renown, coming from England, armed with what he called an indictment of American strategy. And Churchill writes to his wife and says, you know, I mean, he presents himself as this great mastermind of the war, and he says, by making policy and strategy with America is very, very difficult. I feel, this is a quotation, I feel that often that my one hand is tied behind my back. They are so stupid. So the president knows he's in for a real bout when he reaches Cairo. Here they are by the pyramids, and they're in Cairo for about 5 days together. And somehow the president's challenge is how to get this prime minister, who, according to the prime minister's own senior military advisor, is prepared to tell the Americans that he will break the alliance and he will ask them to switch their forces to the Pacific if they don't like his continued Mediterranean strategy. How will he deal with this man? General Allenbrook, who was Churchill's chief of staff, I think we will see a picture of him, actually in his diary said that he felt that his president had gone mad. Again, the president has Eisenhower come to Cairo and give a little presentation of how he sees the war and awards him the Legion of Merit there. So the president, you can probably see, this isn't a very good picture, but you can see, I think, that the president is pretty confident in his own strategy. The question is how to bring this British bulldog to heel. And I think that is General Allenbrook, General Marshall, and the American chiefs of staff here. And how he does it is an extraordinary example of diplomatic and negotiating skill. But he does refuse to agree to delay or abandon D-Day, set for the 1st of May 1944. And Churchill is not best pleased. He uses a Chinese delegation with Chiang Kai-shek to kind of distract attention from having a real fist fight over it. So you can see pretty much how disgruntled the Prime Minister is by the fact that he has not been able to persuade the President of the United States to back down over D-Day. And together, they fly in separate planes to Iran, to Tehran, for the first meeting, or the President's first meeting, with Marshal Stalin. And the President stays at the Russian embassy, Churchill stays at the British embassy or legation, and the President succeeds in getting Marshal Stalin to agree not only to launch a simultaneous million-man Russian offensive on the Eastern Front to coincide with D-Day, Operation Bagration, but even to promise that once the Germans surrender unconditionally, he will put an army of 1 million men to help into the Far East to help the United States to defeat Japan. So the President of the United States, Churchill, is distraught. He's a man of great imagination, and the notion of war in the Mediterranean had captured his imagination. The idea of landing of seizing Rome, of taking Rhodes, of breaking through the Dardanelles, of going to the Crimea, of going into the Balkans, going through the Ljubljana Gap. He had a whole fantasy of how the war could be pursued against Hitler without having to cross the Channel. And when he was overruled by the President and supported in that overruling process by the commander-in-chief of all the Soviet forces, he was furious. In fact, he came back after the first day of discussions to the British legation, and his doctor said to him, well, Prime Minister, he could see something had gone wrong. He said, is everything all right, Prime Minister? Has anything gone wrong? And according to the doctor's diary, Churchill said, a bloody lot has gone wrong. He'd had to agree to D-Day to take place in the spring of 1944. And there is the President delighted with the Russian promise, which was fulfilled. And here is Churchill looking less than happy about it. And So after this triumph in Tehran, the president flies back on the Sacred Cow to Cairo and sends a cable not to General Marshall, but to General Eisenhower. It says, "You will be the supreme commander for the Overlord invasion." But he's not even content with sending this cable. He insists that he fly not straight back to Algeria or Morocco to go back by sea. He insists that he fly back to Tunis to see the general he's appointed to command the D-Day invasion. And there he is with General Eisenhower. And he says he's going to take a few days off, and he wants to visit the American troops at the front in Italy. And General Eisenhower says, I don't think so, Mr. President. We need you. It's a bit too dangerous. So they fly instead to Malta and to Sicily. And there the president decorates General Mark Clark for his bravery at Salerno, and talks to senior officers, and also talks to General Patton, who has been relieved of his command in Sicily, partly because he has slapped the faces of two soldiers in a American soldiers in a field hospital, and there has been a scandal in the American press about it, and so he's under a very dark cloud, and the president calls him up to the back of the Jeep and says to him, "General Patton, between you and me, you will command an army at D-Day, or in the D-Day invasion, the Normandy invasion." So this, in many ways, is, from a military perspective, the most successful, the most historic moment in World War II. What happens? The president says goodbye. There's General Patton in the back of the Jeep with General Clark. The general flies across Algeria and Morocco, takes the USS Iowa back to America, is greeted by members of Congress and the administration as the kind of conquering hero. He's met with Stalin, everything's set for 1944 and victory in World War II. He goes up to Hyde Park, spends Christmas of 1943 with his family around him and his grandchildren. He gives a major broadcast announcing the appointment of General Eisenhower to be the supreme commander for the attack on Germany. He doesn't say where it's going to be, obviously, but that General Eisenhower will be the supreme commander. You can see how good he looks. People say he looked in the pink of health. He was full of beans. And meanwhile, back in Tunis, Churchill, smarting over having failed over D-Day, tells General Eisenhower how pleased he is that General Eisenhower will be going to London to command the D-Day invasion, because then a British officer will become the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces in the Mediterranean under General Alexander. Wasn't the supreme commander, but he was commander-in-chief of the armies. Because he, Churchill, cannot give up this fight over D-Day without at least trying to show what a brilliant, brilliant strategist he is. And even though Eisenhower is unconvinced, Winston Churchill takes over as commander-in-chief. He'd always imagined himself to be this great generalissimo. He'd been to military college. He'd fought in northwest frontier of India and Afghanistan. He'd fought in the Sudan. He'd fought in South Africa. He'd fought in the trenches in World War I. He thought he was a cat's whiskers as a commander-in-chief. He was a commander-in-chief, a combat commander-in-chief. Moncay and Anzio would be his great mini D-Day, his great contribution to military success in the field. 30 miles from Rome, on the coast, landing an Allied army there. It would all be done in like 2 or 3 weeks' time. The Germans would panic and run away, and the Allies would be conquerors of Rome. And Churchill, who'd been brought up on these great histories of the rise and or the decline and fall, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, was full of Rome in his mind. Well, as we know, Anzio was a disaster. 43,000 casualties in 3 months for no purpose whatsoever. And the saddest thing is the President of the United States, who might have been able to stop it, was back in Washington. He'd given that global broadcast, fell ill with flu, and the flu never got better. And so the saddest part of this final volume is it's no longer secret, but it was a story that had to be kept secret, that the president becomes sicker and sicker, and finally his daughter insists that they bring in a consultant. And in March of 1944, shortly before D-Day, the cardiologist they brought in, Navy cardiologist, says the president has severe, not just heart disease, but is in heart failure and has days to live. And so, from FDR's point of view, the story turns from triumph at Tehran to medical strategy, to medical tragedy. And mercifully, his decision to appoint General Eisenhower as the Supreme Commander becomes one of the great appointments in military history. And I try to tell in the book, perhaps for the first time, the really true story of how he decided against using General Marshall in that appointment. But what a brilliant, brilliant command appointment. There is Eisenhower with General Montgomery, who again, Churchill did not want to be commander-in-chief of the Allied armies for D-Day. Those are the two men who really ensured at the highest level that the Allied operation would succeed. And the president was just well enough on D-Day itself to read on radio. It said that there were over 100 million people who heard him, to deliver his great D-Day prayer. I don't know if if you're going to have it in the new museum, which Tim has kindly shown me around. But it is clearly going to be a wonderful exhibition area, and with a lot of audio and film and artifacts. And it is a very moving prayer. Can we urge the powers that be, Don? He's well enough to deliver the prayer, and the landings, as we know, although tricky on day one, especially at Omaha, are an amazing success. The Germans are really stunned by it, and very quickly the logistical backup that's being prepared for over a year in the United States is brought to bear. And as the president had argued, even though it was delayed a little bit by Anzio and the lack of landing craft, it did take place on the 6th of June, and that gave the Allies enough campaigning time in the summer of 1944. And by late August, as we know, the Allies were in Paris and the Germans were retreating back towards the German border after 4 years of occupying most of Europe. I don't think we're going to be able to do much more than that. The book continues FDR's story. It is a biography of FDR as Commander-in-Chief. It continues up to, the president goes out, even though he's dying on his feet, he goes out to the Pacific, to Pearl Harbor, to try and knock the heads of MacArthur and Nimitz together, which he does, and to agree on the strategy for completing the defeat of Japan. But he's in terrible health, and by the time he goes to Yalta, he can really only function mentally, perhaps at most 2 hours a day. It's too sad, and he never wanted, I'm quite certain, certainly the documents show, never wanted to stand for a fourth election. But at that critical moment in the war, with the end game coming up, the agreements to be made about the occupation of Germany, and especially the creation of the United Nations and some better world order than the League of Nations after World War I, there was only one man who could do it. Churchill wasn't actually particularly interested in unconditional surrender, had never been particularly keen on that. And Churchill's main concern was trying to reconstruct the British Empire at the end of the war, whereas FDR wanted to make sure that there would be an organization that could guard against a Third World War. So I think, given his state of health, Yalta is a wonderful achievement. The Russians do agree to the zones of occupation. They do agree to the creation of a United Nations organization, and they do agree to send 1 million Russian troops into Manchuria to deal with the Japanese army there, so that the Americans wouldn't have to deal with them when landing, possibly in the Japanese island. So even as his health is failing, it is an extraordinary achievement, and my only sadness is that after 10 years of doing this, I must say goodbye to President Roosevelt. And perhaps I'm a little sad that his story is perhaps not as well known, his story as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States, and his leadership of those forces is not as well known as it perhaps should be. So even in retirement, I will be trying to ensure that perhaps younger historians will carry on the work I've tried to do. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you. think there's a microphone if somebody's...
If you'll raise your hand if you have a question, I'll bring the microphone around.
Tim, do you want to start? Oh, no, there is...
I wanted you to tell him the story about the landing craft on D-Day that you told me yesterday.
Well, that's interesting, the landing craft. Tim, I think, explained that I divide my time between Boston and New Orleans now. Boston is too cold in the winter and New Orleans is too hot. So for the last 6 years, my wife and I have been spending the winters in New Orleans. And it always puzzled me as to why there was a D-Day museum in New Orleans, but it's because there was a boat builder in New Orleans who was a specialist in making basically hunting and fishing craft that were very shallow bottomed and could be used on the bayous of Louisiana, but particularly around New Orleans. And when the war started, the Navy was looking for, recognized it would need landing craft for troops to debouch onto enemy hostile shores. And so there was a competition held, and this man, Mr. Higgins from New Orleans, who only had a small workforce at that time, went in for the competition and completely destroyed the United States Navy's rival landing craft because he knew what he was doing. And he was able to design a landing craft able to put a whole company of men, perhaps 30 men, onto a hostile shore within a matter of minutes. And his company grew in New Orleans until there were something like 33,000 people working in it. And it is it's a sort of tribute to Higgins. He also made PT boats, but it's a tribute to him that the New Orleans now has the National World War II Museum there. There's a gentleman here.
A couple of things I've read suggested that after that 1943 meeting with Churchill, when Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill got together, they sort of ignored Churchill from time to time, and he had his feelings hurt multiple times. Is that?
Yes, I'm often asked about that because it's to me, it's very, as a historian, it's really sad that this tremendous achievement by the President of the United States in getting finally the British to back down. After all, Churchill had signed the document at Quebec, but he then claimed to his cabinet that it was just a lawyer's agreement and that lawyers' agreements could be broken. I mean, I think any normal president, or even an abnormal president, and we won't go into abnormal presidents, would not have put up with Winston Churchill's insurrection, this indictment that he read out in Cairo, in the way that President Roosevelt did. I mean, something of Roosevelt's character, this sort of personality, this welcoming charm that he had, came to him at that moment to make sure that Churchill, however irritated he would be or distraught, would accept ultimately with good grace the fact that he had failed to stop D-Day. And as we know, by the late spring of 1944, Churchill sent, not only said to General Eisenhower in person, but also sent cables back to Roosevelt and to Stalin saying, this is Churchill, saying that he was hardening to the project. In other words, once the decision had been made in November, the end of November of 1943, although he did try his Anzio project, he no longer attempted to stop D-Day. And even though he didn't believe in it, and by the spring of 1944, as the number of troops increased in Britain, and as he attended presentations of plans held by General Montgomery and General Eisenhower, he began to realize that he'd been wrong, that this actually had every chance of succeeding, and that it could, as Hitler said, it could actually decide the war. And to me, that's the story, that here was this amazing president who managed to dissuade Churchill from his opposition, who never attempted to say to Churchill, oh, well, you know, how silly you were to oppose it or whatever. He never, ever said anything like that. He was had such good grace over it. And yet historians who love and admire Churchill continually pick in the minutes of the conference that took place at Tehran, and there is one moment when the president, when Stalin makes a remark. He says that at the end of the war, the Allies should take 50,000 SS officers, line them up and shoot them. And the president says, I can't remember exactly, but it's something like, oh, no, it should be 51,000. And, you know, clearly that this is being said, you know, this isn't a, you know, formal plan or anything like that. They're sort of joking amongst each other. But Stalin is venting about the fact that the SS have committed such terrible atrocities on the Eastern Front. And the president is trying to, as usual, to sort of calm the atmosphere and so forth. And Churchill at that point, who clearly was suffering the humiliation of having to climb down over D-Day, took this seriously and got up and made as if he was going to leave the room, and Stalin had to get up and go and pull him back and say, it was only a joke, only a joke. So, but historians have picked on this and said, oh, how terrible that the United States president should have humiliated the Prime Minister of Britain. Well, gosh, I am amazed at how well he treated Churchill. There's somebody in the back.
Information spreads really fast nowadays, but during D-Day, how did FDR receive a timely word about what was going on at D-Day? The president had, when war broke out at the time of Pearl Harbor, the president, you know, lived in the mansion, the White House, and then there was the executive offices next door. And incredibly, there wasn't even a war room, as there is now. And Winston Churchill came to stay with the president only a few days after Pearl Harbor, and he brought with him a traveling map room. And FDR thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. So he created, in a ladies' cloakroom on the ground floor at the White House, a map room. And ultimately, that's the beginnings of the war room, the situation room, sorry. And I was able, luckily, to be able to interview the last surviving officer, senior officer of the map room, which was established after Churchill's visit. And to the end of the war, all the cables coming from world leaders came through that map room, but also all major military, naval, and Air Force communications were logged in the map room. So FDR, who'd gone to bed, had his military attaché and his naval attaché bring him the latest
communications from Eisenhower's headquarters to his bedroom, and also listened to see at what point the Eisenhower would announce that the invasion had gone ahead that day. And it was only after that that he delivered his famous prayer. So,
in the selection of General Eisenhower as the commander, any comment in terms of the president, FDR, being of similar personality?
mm-hmm.
Would you...
That's a very interesting point. One could almost write a book about FDR and Eisenhower, because you see, General Eisenhower, just as a brigadier general, had served at the War Department at the time of Pearl Harbor, and afterwards, especially during the catastrophe in the Pacific. And Marshall thought highly of Eisenhower, but so did the president. And actually, Eisenhower had been time and again in the White House from the War Department, gone to the White House to get the president to send. Marshall was, in fact, all the American senior commanders were afraid of MacArthur. After all, MacArthur had been commander in, basically, Chief of Staff of the United States Army. So in a sense, he was senior even to Marshall. And he was the man in the Philippines, the one man still fighting. The British had surrendered, and so at Singapore, and so MacArthur was the only one still fighting. So Eisenhower would go to him to take the president's dictation, really, with General Marshall to send signals to MacArthur, which I've put in the first volume, The Mantle of Command. And I think that was at the point at which the president saw Eisenhower's sort of special talent, that people seemed to warm to him, and that he had a kind of easy intelligence, and could certainly translate the president's wishes into clear army signals, army communications. And so the president appointed Eisenhower to command the American forces in Europe before the Torch invasion, and felt, when he goes to Casablanca, almost the first person he sees is General Eisenhower, who flies to Casablanca to see the president. In fact, while he's in the plane, one or two of the engines fail, and there's this incredible moment where this, future Supreme Commander and future President thinks he's going to have to bail out of the plane with a parachute. But in fact, the pilot manages to land it at Casablanca. And always the president is assessing him in terms of his ability as a commander in the field, and how the other commanders, like General Clark and to some degree General Patton, defer to Eisenhower. And when it comes to the moment of choosing a supreme commander, I can't go into the whole detail of it, but I try to tell in this final volume just how he made that decision, and how proud he was of Eisenhower's achievement in Normandy, and would love to have even made kind of theoretical arrangements to go and see Eisenhower in the field in Normandy, just as he had in North Africa. But he was so sick
I don't think he would have ever made it at that point. And the question of the similarity of their characters is something I've always felt is remarkable to two men who become presidents of the United States. One I think I wish we could ask General Eisenhower, but I think he did, to some degree, model himself on the way, that easy way of commanding presence that FDR had. Thank you for the question. Did you have a question, Tim?
I wondered.
Where's that?
Well, I was going to ask about the unconditional surrender, and was that part of a strategy of FDR's to ensure that there'd be an invasion, since unconditional surrender would require occupation?
I don't know that he thought that far ahead. I think I was I understand, the first historian to find the origins of the unconditional surrender about 5 weeks before he went to Casablanca, because he was visited at the White House by the Canadian Prime Minister. And all historians are grateful to Prime Minister Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister of Canada, for dictating every night to his stenographer 7, 8, 9, 10 pages of diary entries of what he was told by the President of the United States. And I say that because FDR had quite a hostile press in the United States. We think we have a partisan press today, but it was in some ways even worse in the early 1940s. And there were press owners like McCormick who hated the president. And the president's victory plan, for instance, was deliberately leaked by these opponents in the press before Pearl Harbor. That is a plan for how a war would be waged against enemies or opponents if war came to the United States. So the tantalizing thing for a historian and biographer of FDR compared with Winston Churchill is that Winston Churchill loves putting everything into ink or oratory. And so we have wonderful records of everything Winston Churchill thought or said at any moment in World War II, whereas often we have tantalizingly little as to what FDR said, because he didn't like records to be kept that could be used against him, especially in terms of the Congress. I mean, this was a pretty isolationist country until Pearl Harbor. So this Canadian Prime Minister stayed in the White House with the President over a month before Casablanca and recorded his discussions with the President, which I've put in the book. And in volume 2. And it's clear from those discussions that FDR's decision to call for unconditional surrender was part of his feeling that American forces would first have to learn how to defeat the Wehrmacht. And this was going to be really tough. You know, Hitler hadn't conquered most of Europe without reason. I mean, without effective opposition, for no reason. The Wehrmacht was really tough. And if American forces, after all, they'd only
at one point in the summer of 1941, the draft was only restarted for a second draft by one vote in Congress. Americans had most American troops, even though they'd gone into basic training, had absolutely no idea what they would be facing in terms of the Wehrmacht, who'd been fighting since 1939 and 40, and even before that in Czechoslovakia. And so I think his feeling was unconditional surrender, first of all, so that American troops and their commanders would understand this is total war. We're not hoping that they'll run away and negotiate or anything like that. This is really going to be tough, and it has to be unconditional, no negotiation. But I think he also felt that in terms of the wars, the end of the war, that he didn't want the war to go back to that position of November 1918, of Versailles, of Hitler, a new Hitler being able to say, oh, we were never actually defeated. After all, the Allies never actually got into Germany in World War I. So it was going to have to be total war and unconditional surrender in that sense. And it is interesting, right at the very end of this volume, the head of the OSS in Switzerland did attempt to start negotiating an end to the war with the SS, with the idea that the United States, or the Allies, the Western Allies, would suddenly negotiate with the SS and declare war on the Soviet Union. And that very nearly blew up the end-of-war agreement, zones of occupation, the Russian army in Manchuria and so forth. So I think the unconditional surrender was one of the great decisions the president made. I've probably exhausted you all, but certainly exhausted me.